There had been a question submitted via email about using restart files. So I thought I would just give a quick review of how to use restart files. With the restart files, there's a couple tactics to using them. And so the concept of the restart file is that any simulation that has already run, you can download the state of that simulation a point in time, anywhere from the beginning until the point at which the simulation has run, and download that simulation state, and then restart the simulation with different parameters. And so where we commonly use this is to download a restart in between fracturing and production, as there are some parameters that you can change that will be dominant drivers of production, but have a very limited impact on the hydraulic fracturing. For instance, relative permeability generally will have a negligible impact on hydraulic fracturing dynamics, but could have a very large effect on production. And so you can save a lot of time on iterating on a history match if you use a restart file and are just modifying your relative permeabilities just prior to turning the well online. So a couple steps to follow in carrying out a restart simulation. The first is to determine where to grab a restart file. And the second, we'll actually download it. So let me show that. And so this is a simulation that I kicked off yesterday. And it's just a little demonstration simulation. And if I wanted to download a restart file after fracturing, what I would normally do is I'd open it up in the builder, come down to well controls, and see at what point my production sequence starts. So it starts at 3.3 days. So that means if I wanted a restart file, I probably want to download one right around 3 days, such that it is saving the state of the simulation prior to the production period. So then I would come and I would say open comments file. And the comments file is actually spitting out everything that's happening in the simulation. And I think my comments file may look a little bit different than yours, just because I have advanced reporting turned on. But the overall format is exactly the same, or not exactly, is very similar in that what the code is reporting into the comments file is what's happening at every single time step. So you can see at the top of each block of text, it gives a time step number, in this case, time step number 42. And then it'll report what is happening in the code. So you can see here's my well. It has a wellhead pressure of 3922, and it's injecting water at 12.1 barrels per minute. The limiting factor here is flow velocity, and you can go through and kind of read exactly what's happening. What we are interested in is what is the time in the simulation. So you can see there is a row that will start with time step duration, and in this case it's very short because it's in the middle of fracturing and a whole bunch of things are happening in the simulation. And then it also reports the cumulative time elapsed. So this is where we want to look for that 3 days. Currently the simulation is at 1.014 hours. So what I'll do is I'll scroll way down and take another look. So now I'm at 8.8 hours. I come down farther. Oh, here I'm at 3.35. So I'll come back a little bit. Oh, there's 1 day, 1.15. once you get used to this, your eyes will start picking out that line very easily. And maybe I'll continue down here. It's 2 days, 2.25, 2.5, we're getting close, 2.86, and we don't have to be exact here, as I'll show. So here we're at 3.06. So what I'll do is I'll scroll up and find the time step that that's at. So that is the beginning of time step 7300. I will go back to the job manager, same simulation, come over to the ellipses and choose the option download restart files. And you can see here, restart files are available about every 25 time steps. Sometimes the frequency is reduced if you're in the late life of a simulation. But I can scroll down and find, there's my restart at time step 7300. I'll check that box and download. And if I wait, what I will see is a little toaster icon pop up on the upper right of my screen that will say that that restart file has been downloaded successfully. There it is. And restart files are generally 25 to 100 megabytes. Depending on the complexity and scale of simulation and your internet speed, it may take 1 to 5 minutes to download that restart file. Then, when I choose to copy that simulation, and I'll just give it the default name of copy 1, I'll get a second option and it says, do you want to copy the restart files? And in this case, yes, I would like to copy those files. And then I'll see the structure if I open that in the File Explorer. You can see here's my input and settings file, and I now have a folder called restart files, and it will include that restart at 7300. So then the next logical question is, what sort of files can be changed using a restart? And if you ever have a question, just email us and we can advise. The very common ones to modify in a restart file are global permeability. And so often that would be done through the global permeability multiplier. But you could also modify the permeability of individual zones in a restart file. Relative permeability, as we discussed before, the propant permeability, which is that K0 multiplier factor in your propant table, adding or removing a zero permeability cube, changing your wellbore friction, and changing well controls. So if you already ran a simulation through fracturing and originally you were on an oil rate control and you want to see what a bottom hole pressure control looks like, you can very easily change that in a restart without having to go back to the beginning. Parameters that cannot be changed or should not, so it might not always fail if you do this, but would also not be best practice, are kind of the initial conditions that you would expect to be changing throughout the duration of a simulation. So like the initial saturation, water saturation, or the initial stress state of the model, that's going to impact stresses will impact fracture geometries. Saturations could impact how it's trying to account for fluids. For instance, during fracturing, water is leaking off from the fractures. So if you change the initial saturation, the code doesn't really know how to accommodate that. The number of fracture strands, if you're using the multi-strand correlation, your fluid model properties, right? So you can't go and change formation oil volume factor in the middle of a simulation, or the well locations of existing wells. But I will note we do have a drill well option where you can actually drill a new well, and you can do that from a restart. So if your simulation originally had 3 wells and you want to see what happens if you add a 4th well, you can use the drill new well functionality after the time at which you've downloaded a restart, and the code will accommodate accordingly. Another one that I should list here is meshing. So you shouldn't change mesh dimensions. So you can't make your matrix larger or smaller, or change the element size in a restart. So I will pause there for a second to see if there's questions. Tristan or Charles, if you're looking at the chat channel, I seem to have lost my chat window.
Yeah, I see 2 questions. One, can we add a new production sequence during a restart if it did not exist in the original simulation?
Yep. Yeah, you would just have to make sure that it doesn't. So I downloaded a restart here at 3.06 days. And so if I wanted to add a new well control sequence, just make sure it's not in the middle of that 3.06. So if I come back to well controls on my simulation copy here, you can see that 3.06 days is going to be in the middle of this shut-in. So as long as I started that shut-in or the new control after 3.06, so let's say this production sequence, I could actually modify this to be earlier. So if I did, 70 hours, that's now starting at 3.27, and that is fine because the code knows that it's still shut in at 3.06. It's now just going to start a little bit earlier, and I could change, say produce at 1500 PSI instead of the 1200. What I'd want to avoid is putting in something like 24 here. And so now you can see that this production sequence is starting at 1.35. However, the code is not going to know what to do, because when you took that restart at 3.06, it thinks this well is shut in. But now at 3.06 days, you're in the middle of this production control. And so at the very least, that will yield a nonsensical result, but it could also cause the simulator to crash. Additionally, this one, you can see I only have a single control step in my production sequence. I can very easily add a block, and I could add, a ResFrac sequence. So, right, I could re-inject into the same well, so long as it's after that 3.06 days. Right, and I could fill this out, and the restart file would do so correctly. And Charles, you said there was a second question.
There's another question, yep. Another question about drilling a new well. It is as follows. If drilling the new well, we need to expand the matrix grid, will that be a problem?
Yes, it will. So you can only drill the new well if it were inside of the original mesh or grid dimensions.
So could you do something like set up a bigger matrix mesh for the original simulation and then turn on a 0 perm cube, something like that, to accommodate this kind of workflow?
Yeah, exactly. So you can see here's the wellbore drilling times. So I just have one well in this model, but if I were to add a well, and you can see now my wellbore drilling times has 2 different rows. I could make this one something at like, let's see, if we did 17,000 hours, that's about 2 years. So that would be 2 years into the life of the simulation. And then I would just specify the coordinates scrolling fast, to be within my matrix mesh. And if I didn't know where that well was going to be, as Charles said, I could just make my mesh much larger. So if the Y direction is the direction perpendicular to my wellbore azimuth, I could make this something like 15,000 feet. So a little less than 3 sections wide. And then use the zero permeability cube, which is in the static model, to zero out permeability far away. So I think my well is centered around the origin. And so if I wanted that original scope, but still, oh, that's the center. Sorry, I messed this up. So my Y dimension, I would want to be something like 5,000. X length, we can just make arbitrarily large. Same with the Y length, or Z length rather. And then what that will give me is my well will originally only have access to that original, or that initial 5,000 feet, 2,500 feet on either side. And I could have the zero perm cube end at 17,000 hours. And then when I drill my new well, it could be then accommodated in that area that I have just unlocked.
Another question from the chat is, can you comment on what needs to be done if the original simulation is on a different version and wasn't using the restart file, like basically about compatibility between restart file versions and simulator versions?
Yeah, great question. One that is good to pay attention to. If we come back to the comments file and you scroll all the way to the top, the comments file will report the code version being used. So that's the restart version. And then this says the original code revision number 148, deployed on July 1st. And then this is the simulation or the simulator sub type. So if you ever were emailing us, this row right here with that serial number helps us track down the exact version. But let's say you downloaded a restart like a month ago. Then on this copy I make, when I go to run the simulation, you can see I can select restart files. So there may be instances where I have multiple restart files, particularly if I'm doing like a parent-child simulation, because then I may have a restart after the initial parent frac job and then another one after the child frac jobs, etc. So you can always select which restart file to use. And then you can also select the simulator version. And you can see there's that same serial number. And so if you had downloaded the restart from a simulation run with a prior version, you would just want to go ahead and go back to that prior version when submitting this simulation. And now you'll notice when I submit, it'll take an extra couple minutes because it has to upload that 25 to 100 megabyte file along with the original input and settings file.